Hi, I'm Thomas Quinn with a few minutes of not-so-eternal truth. I'm a documentary writer-producer for Discovery Channel and the like, and I wanted to share a few brief stories about the end of the world from my book, What Do You Do with a Chocolate Jesus? An Irreverent History of Christianity. It's sort of a history of the religion as told by The Daily Show. It's funny, but it's also factual, and you can get it, by the way, exclusively on Amazon.com. Okay, enough of the commercial. Anyway, the first account comes from the end of the first millennium, which is a great time for an end-of-the-world panic. It seems that a monk from Burgundy, named Raoul Glaber, saw a famine, earthquakes, the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 993, and the death of Pope Gregory V in 999 as ominous portents of the end. To its credit, the Catholic Church had ignored most of this lunacy, but that didn't stop lots of pilgrims from trekking to the Holy Land in time for the apocalypse, dropping to their knees in fervent prayer for every shooting star or black cat along the way. Another story happened in 1219, when European Christians heard tales of a warrior prince who was vanquishing their Muslim enemies in the East, and he was thought to be a guy named Prester John, a Christian hero whom legend said would reunite the world in the last days and bring back the lost tribes of Israel. But then, one day, the news came back that this prince had just conquered Vienna, a Christian city. Turns out their legendary hero was Genghis Khan. Oops. Around 1260, there was a doomsday cult in Italy called the Flagellants. That's the flagellants, as in flogging, not as in indigestion. Now, these guys went from town to town publicly beating themselves into spiritual ecstasy with iron-tipped leather whips. The idea was to share the sufferings of Christ on the eve of the apocalypse. At least, that was their excuse. Apparently, they were very naughty boys. Another end-of-the-world believer was none other than Christopher Columbus. Sure, he was a hard-headed navigator, but he also thought that the gold he might find in the New World could finance the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem, and that might hasten the return of Christ. You know, the guy was always looking for a shortcut. Now, one of my favorite doomsday panic peddlers was a Dominican friar named Girolamo Savonarola. In the late 1400s, he became a strident moral reformer and one of Europe's most pious pains in the ass. He was the Joe McCarthy of his day, basically. He saw enemies everywhere, and he thought that the Renaissance city of Florence would become the site of the New Jerusalem in the end times, as soon as he finished destroying everything that was good about the place. Savonarola specialized in puking up rage against the decadence of both the city and the Catholic Church. He denounced sexual pleasure, of course, along with makeup, perfume, jewelry, and pretty much anything else that made you look good in daylight. It was him who sparked the famous bonfires of the vanities, which called for the burning of fashion accessories and gambling doodads and lewd artworks, including a Botticelli or two, and even musical instruments. The man was a fart in a sack. He slammed the church so hard for corruption that the Pope offered to make him a cardinal just to shut him up. Instead, he spent 3 years revving up outrage and violence until he ticked off so many people that he was finally accused of heresy. In the end, he was excommunicated, tortured, hanged, and then burned. Nobody seems to miss him. Only a little less annoying was Martin Luther, the father of the Protestant Reformation, who once said, "I am sure that the day of the judgment is just around the corner." That was in the early 1500s. But perhaps the most colorful doomsday dingbat was an actor named John van Leyden. He joined the radical Dutch Anabaptists, and in 1534 he established a messianic little kingdom in Munster, Germany. He claimed everyone except his own followers, of course, were about to be wiped out in an apocalypse. But what's weird about this guy is the way he launched his messianic gig, by running naked through the streets and then falling into a trance for 3 days. Somehow it worked. Soon after, he started demanding everyone's silver and gold, and then he started pushing for strict sexual behavior, that is, until he himself became a polygamist. Under his regime, the people were milked for every dime they had, and if anyone objected, they were beheaded. After a year of this crap, his rivals finally rose up against him. He was sentenced to death, shackled to a stake, then burned with hot pincers, and finally detongued. Now here's a good one. Back in 1806, in the town of Leeds, England, a small panic broke out when a hen started laying eggs with the words, "Christ is coming," written on the shell. Obviously, someone wrote those words on the eggs, but then stuffed them back into the poor chicken. Woof! Oh, and by the way, this stunt doesn't work so well with sheep. One of the most important and most successful doomsday panics got started in the 1830s by William Miller, who built up a huge following across the United States by preaching the imminent return of Jesus. On October 22nd, 1844, thousands of his followers braced for the end, and some of them even dug their own graves and waited next to them. When Jesus was a no-show, the event became known as the Great Day of Disappointment. Miller's following fizzled, but a few diehards stuck it out and morphed into today's Seventh-day Adventists. Finally, we have the late Jerry Falwell, the founder of the now-defunct Moral Majority. This right-wing reverend was among the first fundamentalists, well, not one of the first ones, but he was one of the famous fundamentalist frauds, who had millions believing that the Cold War was a preamble to Armageddon. In the introduction to his 1983 book, Nuclear War and the Second Coming of Jesus Christ, he wrote, quote, "One brings thoughts of fear, destruction, and death, while the other brings thoughts of joy and hope and life. They almost seem inconsistent, and yet they are indelibly intertwined." Jesus and nuclear war. Falwell also said the attacks of September 11th on New York and Washington were God's punishment for America's tolerance of abortion and homosexuality. You know, it's incredible to me that these radical reverends always know exactly which offenses get God to blow his stack. And it's always those offenses. It's never war, torture, greed, or Christmas ads in October. Anyway, this and a lot more can be found in my little book, What Do You Do with a Chocolate Jesus? Available on Amazon.com. I hope you forgive the commercial there, and thank you for listening. This has been Thomas Quinn with a few minutes of not-so-eternal truth.